I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. This is a special podcast today because we're following up on a night of attacks by Israel on Iran's nuclear program and other assets in Iran. I've assembled the dream team here, my colleagues, Emily Harding, who is Vice President of our Defense and Security Department, Ben Jensen, who is head of our Futures Lab at CSIS, and Dr. Seth Jones, who is the Harold Brown Chair and President of our Defense and Security Department here at CSIS. Welcome, colleagues.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be on.
Emily, I want to start with you. What was the Israelis' biggest objective here in this operation?
They have seen Iran as kind of the force behind all of the events for the last 2+ years. And in their view, they cannot feel safe, which is something they've been pursuing for the past 2 years, until the Iranian threat, which Israel views as an existential threat, has been beaten back. So this was kind of always in the cards, that they were going to go hit at Iran in a fundamental way, in a way that would prevent them from threatening the survival of Israel in the near term. So what they are trying to do here is actually very similar to what they did to Hezbollah. You can see the same pattern. They've done decapitation strikes where they've prevented the Iranian military, and especially the IRGC, which is kind of their elite force, from responding by disrupting their leadership. Some people in the West are calling this the Red Wedding, because basically what they did was they tricked a whole bunch of IRGC commanders to come into one location, and then they hit that location. And the estimates are as high as they may have killed 70 to 80 top military leadership. That's hard to recover from, even for a very professional military. So they did the decapitation strike on the military. That makes it very hard to respond. They took out air defense, and now they're pursuing the more strategic targets since they have an open runway, so to say. So they're going after nuclear facilities. They're going after missile facilities. They're basically trying to preempt Iran's ability to hit Israel with missiles, with big missiles, and then in the future, potentially nuclear-tipped missiles, before Iran can actually get that breakout capacity. The big question that I have, and I actually asked one of my friends who's a former IDF general this earlier, so when is it going to be enough? If Israel can't completely destroy Iran's nuclear program, and they know that, because you can't blow up knowledge, and the knowledge is going to exist inside Iran one way or another. And if you can't completely destroy the knowledge and you can't completely destroy every single piece of equipment, then where does that leave you in getting enough done that you feel like you can stop? And he was very honest. He said, no, you're right. There is never going to be an enough. What we really want to do is buy ourselves 2 years, 5 years, maybe even 10 years. And if there is an unintended consequence here, that it weakens the Iranian regime from the inside because they look weak, because they look feckless, then all the better. But it's going to be enough for us if we can buy ourselves a few more years of avoiding that existential threat. It remains to be seen whether the tactics they've used are going to match up with that actual strategic goal. But they are all in on trying to accomplish as much as they can and dismantle Iran's fighting capability the same way that they did Hezbollah's.
I want to follow up with you on that, Emily. What is the difference between the tactics they're using and the overarching strategy? Do they mesh?
We'll see. This is, day 2 of what will be at least a 14-day set of activities. And if they can get to a point where they have almost completely gutted Iran's capability to enrich, and if they think they know enough, and Israeli intelligence is very good, where they can hit the actual weaponization work that's going on with the Iranian nuclear weapons, then, that could buy them 2 years, maybe. It really depends on what happens on the backside and whether Iran does what President Trump wants them to do and come back to the negotiating table and try to hold on to perhaps a small capability to enrich as sort of a point of pride, or whether they go complete porcupine and then try to sprint towards a nuclear weapon as fast as they can on the backside. Clearly, the smarter road would be the negotiation road, but it's hard to say what the Iranians are going to do for a very emotional response to just eliminating this huge cadre of leadership.
Let's talk about that and talk about the response. Ben, I want to get your take on this. You study responses and strikes. This is what you do. So tell me, how do you see this?
All right. Ben, the mad scientist, is going to break this down. I think the first baseline prediction we make about any major military operation is the past, or what Thomas Schelling called the interdependence of commitments. If you want to understand someone's logic and how they think about strategy and operations, look at what they've done in the past. And that's your kind of baseline prediction. So if we do that, we can do the following. Well, one, we really can look first at things like just a year ago, April 2024, Iran launched Operation True Promise. And so this was in retaliation of Israel. And so Operation True Promise saw roughly a little over 300. So it was a mix of drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles, largely ineffective. Israel, along with the U.S. and other partners, were able to shoot down a lot of those and effectively defang what Iran thought was a calibrated response. Remember, Iran, from all signs, thought that Operation True Promise, even though it was 300 munitions flying at Israeli air bases and cities, was a calibrated response to Israel killing two of its IRGC generals. So first kind of thing to look at is if they were willing to launch 300 munitions because of two IRGC generals, what do they do if the red wedding is true? And now it's significant members of your senior leaders, and you also have a culture of martyrdom. So this isn't just a political question, it's a cultural question. So that's one option. The other option is if, let's say, Israel was tremendously successful, which I think they were, it's too soon to tell, and hit a lot of the command and control, but also ballistic missile storage facilities, and Iran can't launch a mass salvo or even a calibrated mass salvo, you might see something that looked like what happened really between October 2023 and January 2024, when Iran was using proxies to launch ballistic missiles and rocket salvos at U.S. bases in the area. Now, why I don't think that's going to happen is even though Iran kept saying they're going to hit us, they're not completely that stupid. They're pretty far into the stupid camp, but they're not so far into the deep end that they're going to drag the U.S. into the war when the U.S. clearly was signaling, both in public and private, hey, this is Israel, that's on Netanyahu, we're trying to negotiate with you. Now, the third option that gets more interesting is something that looks like this. So we often forget that Iran almost took down significant portions of Saudi's oil infrastructure in 2012 with Operation Shamoon, and then followed that up in 2019 in response to Yemen with waves of drones and then ballistic missiles at Saudi oil infrastructure. I don't think they're going to do this one, more likely than the U.S., but it might be out of spite, hold the entire global economy hostage through hitting oil infrastructure. Weirdly, why I don't think that'll happen is most Iranian oil is sold to China under pre-negotiated fixed price contracts, so they don't economically benefit if oil prices shoot up in the short term, oddly enough. China's not like, oh, you're right, I'm going to give you so much money for your oil now. They'll probably take the cheap oil and sell it on the open market for more expensive rates. So that really breaks down the thing. What we should really watch for is really the next 5 to 7 days is can Iran launch the type of mass ballistic, cruise, and drone strikes that we know they're capable for. Remember, Operation True Promise at 300 was seen as a calibrated limited response. And the expectation was for even more. That's what you're really going to have to watch for. If Iran cannot do that in the next 5 to 7 days, and even if it does, if Israel finds a clever way to intercept most of them, Netanyahu has the runway for the 14-day campaign, assuming he's hit the targets that he needs to achieve his operational objectives in pursuit of this elusive strategic end state. And the last one is Iran, as time immemorial, threatened to close down the Strait of Hormuz. It's like the emptiest promise to this day. That is probably something they're going to discuss at this point. But again, that risks drawing them into a conflict with Gulf states and the United States. So all of those options laid out lead us back to mass salvo attack against Israel. And the only way they can do that is once they figure out, sorting through the rubble, who's actually even left alive in leadership and who puts together the strike package to launch that.
Seth, I want to turn to you. What are the challenges here that Israel's facing now that they have launched this opening salvo? Obviously, the country is on red alert. They really know about going to shelters by now, but people are on edge. What are some of the challenges that Israel's facing?
Andrew, thanks, and great comments from both Ben and Emily. And let me just start before directly answering that question is to highlight one of the things Emily said, which was, I think we've seen, including in some trips to Israel recently, that the Israelis have increasingly interpreted the combat and the conflicts that they've been involved in Gaza, the West Bank, the incoming missiles and drones they've had to deal with from the Houthis, some of the standoff weapons they've gotten from Syria, in addition to the Iranian salvos, is all under the umbrella of Iranian activity. So this is sort of the Israeli interpretation of the threat picture, and the piecing together of all of these non-state, or in some cases quasi-state actors, is all going back to Iran. I think this helps understand why the big focus on Iran. There are some challenges, though, that Israel faces. One of them is we know that they were hoping to get U.S. direct participation in the response. They did not. President Trump made that explicit both privately and publicly. The Israelis, I think, ideally were hoping that the U.S. would provide aircraft as well as potentially boots on the ground. But on the aircraft, U.S. bombers, for example, which the Israelis really don't have, certainly not in the depth that the U.S. does, for penetrating bombs deep underground against Iranian nuclear facilities would have been extremely helpful.
Yeah, we're talking about bunker busters here, correct?
Big bunker buster bombs coming from U.S. bombers out of locations like Diego Garcia would have been helpful, just in addition to spreading the target set away from just Israel itself. I think would have been helpful for Israel, for the U.S. to join. And I think it became very clear right away when Marco Rubio announced that the U.S. was not involved, that there was a pretty clear U.S. break from this military operation. That's one challenge at the moment. Unless Iran responds and brings in the U.S. by targeting them, this is about Israel right now, and the Israelis will get the bulk of the response. That is not what they were hoping for, but I think they decided that was what they had to do in the end. In addition, I think the timelines for the Israelis, there's certainly a hope that this lasts for several days, potentially up to 14. I think the challenge, though, is that the Iranians over time, including with the United States, have been willing to be patient in response. So there will be the initial attempt to respond with a salvo, potentially of conventional weapons. But the Iranians still do have partner forces in Yemen. They've got them in Lebanon. They've got them in Syria. They've got them in Iraq. And many of those groups, as well as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, have a capability to strike Israeli embassies and Israelis in multiple locations across the globe. So I think the second challenge the Israelis face is they have now a conventional and an asymmetric threat that is likely to persist for months, if not longer. That means, I think, if you're living in Israel right now, you are now hunkering down almost certainly for a protracted, potentially conflict where over the next 14 days, I think the Israelis expect a response. The longer this persists, there may be some element of Iranian surprise somewhere at some point, depending on where they decide to go. And I think there is a potential for this really to be protracted. The third challenge, and this is probably more for the U.S. than the Israelis, I think this eliminates for any sort of near-term purpose, this eliminates the negotiations. So President Trump had hoped to negotiate some kind of deal with the Iranians. I suspect the Iranians conclude that actually this is why they need nuclear weapons, not to give them up at this point. So it probably ends the diplomatic negotiation at least for this period of time. And I think just taking a big step back on the challenges, we have moved, I would argue, way up the escalatory ladder now that we've got even more state-on-state conflict. And that puts us even into a different realm from what we've seen with the two Iranian salvos and the Israeli responses last year.
Let me ask you guys this. How vulnerable now, it seems like some of these strikes were pretty successful on Iran. How vulnerable are the Iranians now to more Israeli attacks? And really, I guess the big question is, how vulnerable are the mullahs to being overthrown? We're hearing lots of letters from the Shah of Iran, who's here in America, saying he's ready to come home. We've been hearing that for years. How vulnerable are they?
So let me jump on this one quick, because part of me thinks that this also lends itself to a good predictive market or an office betting pool. of what happens next. Whenever you inject a lot of energy and chaos into a system, the degrees of freedom increase for ranges of possible outcomes. So it's time for more creative red teaming than narrow predictions. And so I think you're right to hit on the first one that I would bring up. What's the over-under that the Iranian people actually do rise up now? We know there's discontent. From initial reports, it looks like this was insanely surgical. So it specifically hit military facilities in a way that the regime, even though it's Iranian sovereign state has been struck, will be able to show masses of citizens. In fact, Iran's killed more of its citizens than Israel did. So now it's a question of, does that create the vector for social unrest? The other interesting kind of wild card bets here, what's the over-under that China uses this to try to claim it's this great diplomatic actor and try to push for a larger role as seen as being the kind of offshore balancer of the Middle East? So at what point does the private jets with diplomats from Beijing come to talk about de-escalation to position themselves? Because frankly, they buy a lot more Middle Eastern oil than we do. So to basically kind of continue that transition you've seen of kind of the U.S. as the external power broker to the Middle East all the way to China. And then frankly, on the other side too, there is a possibility that Iran in a desperate counterattack actually gets lucky and actually does pull one of these extreme moves that actually leads to a much broader conflict that pulls in Saudi Arabia, pulls in other Gulf states. It's back to the old theory of prospect theory, right? They are in a losses frame. So they are going to take potentially unpredictable levels of risk to try to regain some position of strength. So those would be kind of the wild card over-under bets I'd lay out that we probably want to watch for, as well as the more likely things we see playing out over the next week to 2 weeks.
Ben raised the China card, but in the sense of sort of coming in to negotiate. One of the things that's been interesting in watching the Houthi activity targeting U.S. naval vessels and commercial vessels in the Red Sea is how much the Houthis have benefited from Russian and Chinese state participation, including the commercial sector from China and Russia on intelligence, in some cases on components for munitions. So really interesting is we've seen the Russians benefit from Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean aid to the war in Ukraine. To what degree, sort of clandestinely, do we see any assistance at all? Because I suspect the Iranians may want now the Russians to repay them for what they have given, including with drones to the Russians. To what degree the Russians and the Chinese in particular will be willing to provide some types of assistance? That's unclear at this point. The other thing I would just add to what you asked and what Ben answered is that a big strategic objective for the Israelis, and we've been hearing it for some time, is a hopeful overthrow of this regime. Again, as the U.S. has experienced in both Afghanistan and Iraq, it is really difficult to engineer, particularly from the outside. You often do not get what you hope for. I suspect even for Israel, some element of civil war would probably be a post-net benefit outcome. But I think, it's going to be really hard to engineer this from the outside. So we'll have to see how that objective actually works out.
Let me follow up on that for a second, Seth. And Emily, please jump in here as well. Is Iran alone here, or are they really going to be able to count on North Korea, count on Russia, count on China, or are they alone?
Two pieces there. First, in response to the internal unrest thing, if the Israelis really want to create internal unrest, the force they need to hit is not the IRGC, it's the Basij. And the Basij are responsible for internal security inside Iran. That is going to be their entire focus right now. And there will be like a rally around the flag effect for the Iranian people, less so than perhaps in democracies, but it will exist. And the Basij are going to be responsible for tamping down any kind of internal unrest, and they will do it ruthlessly. On who are Iran's friends? We are seeing the Russians and the Iranians growing closer together as they're both under pressure. I think that the Chinese probably will show up in jet airplanes. They may also jet away very quickly. They haven't really been willing to invest and put a lot of skin into negotiations elsewhere in the Middle East. I'll be surprised if they can sort of pull the diplomatic weight to do it this time. But, who knows? Ben's absolutely right. You inject a lot of chaos into a system, and really surprising things can occur on the back end. I think that Iran has lost so many of its traditional strengths and allies. Syria is not the friend it used to be even a year ago. Hezbollah is dramatically weakened. The Houthis are, in fact, under pressure. The Gulfies have kind of like reached an olive branch out to Iran a couple times and then pulled it back rather quickly. And they're going to be secretly very excited about this development. So they're not alone, but they don't have great friends coming to their aid either.
Just one comment on that. I think, as I read Chinese and Russian assistance to the Iranians and the Houthis in and around the Red Sea, it's a lot less about Iran per se and more about expending U.S. munitions on, for its navy, which has been significant. So the question partly on friends is to what degree there is an effort by the Chinese and or the Russians to try to pull the U.S. into this or target U.S. military assets in the region. We don't know at this point. That appears to be a reason for providing the types of assistance they've done with the Houthis, because they've gone after U.S. Naval vessels. So, I think that will be something interesting to watch.
Seth, going back to this discussion about vulnerabilities and implications for regional stability, our good friend Norm Rule talks about how this has massive implications for regional stability. You both have mentioned that the Gulf states are on Israel's side and are maybe not overtly, but certainly behind the scenes cheering Israel on. What happens with a really protracted battle here, potential? What happens to the region? People are really worried today, not just about our ally in the region, not just about the Persian people who live in Iran, who are subject to the tyranny of the leadership there, but people are worried about the region. What are your thoughts there, Emily? Let's go to you first.
This is where Ben's unpredictability, I think, really comes into play. There could be several sparks that take this in a completely different direction than what I'm about to lay out. So I'll talk about what I think the straight line possibilities are, and then what could actually be the wild cards that change that. On the straight line possibilities, let's go around the region. Israel is very much assuming that they are going to take some hits, and they're ready for that. They're going to see that as the tit for tat that they expect. If you switch around to the Gulf, they too have come out and, officially condemned Israel's actions. But behind the scenes, you can kind of see them there with the popcorn being like, oh yeah, let's get rid of Iran's nuclear program. That would be fabulous. As long as Iran does not try to do something like hit U.S. bases and positions in the Gulf, then the Gulfies are going to try to stay out of this one. However, if the Iranians do something against Saudi Arabia or against the Emirates or against Qatar or Bahrain, where we do have facilities, then you could see them getting involved, at least in a token way, to respond and to say, no more. You're not doing this against our people. If you keep going around and you look at Iraq, that is something that I would be looking very closely at. One of the announcements about the voluntary departure of diplomats and families was Baghdad, because that is so embedded inside the Iranian orbit. It's entirely possible that Iraq could get pulled into this kind of on both sides, because there is still, some ties to the U.S., but then also these really strong ties to Iran. They're going to be a wild card. And right now, Turkey is sitting up there sort of saying, well, we're not really involved, but we want peace in the region. And they could be a tipping point if they decided to get involved one way or another. I've gotten a lot of questions in the last 48 hours about what is this going to do to the global economy? What's this going to do to shipping? What's this going to do to oil? What's this going to do to trade? You're going to see oil prices go up a lot. In a weird way, that's going to help Russia and it's going to help Iran, which is not what we wanted. But you're also going to see, I think, people have factored in instability in a lot of what they're doing in business. And so that is not going to be as big a deal as I think it might have been maybe a year ago. So I think that if straight line, what you're going to see is this exchange between Israel and Iran directly. The big number one wild card is, do they go after the U.S.? Do they pull the U.S. into this one? And then you are looking at a wider regional conflagration.
Seth, over to you. And I also want to answer the question, how vulnerable is Israel? Israel, the last time Iran attacked, the UK, France, Israel, the United States, all were shooting down Iran's rockets headed towards Israel. How vulnerable is Israel now, and will Israel's allies come to its aid?
So first, I think a big variable, and both Emily and Ben have talked about this to some degree, is how will the Iranian regime come out of this? There had been some question about how, as the Russians got bogged down in Ukraine, Putin would come out of it. There was the Prigozhin march on the Kremlin, and that at the end of the day faltered. Prigozhin was killed. And for the moment, Putin has been able to stabilize both himself and his position domestically. Part of the question here will be, will the Iranian regime under the supreme leader be able to stabilize the regime? The more that's likely, I think the more we'll see the Iranians will potentially want to hit back. The more the regime is weakened and they have to basically fight for survival internally, and there's a civil war, we see elements of supportive of the Shah or others, and we see kind of the Syria outcome, which is basically, internal civil war insurgency in the country. That may create additional problems for the regime, including domestically. So that's one big variable that I don't think we're in a position to know yet. The second is, how does the U.S. get involved? One of the big vulnerabilities I think the Israelis have is, if this does become protracted in some way, the Israelis don't have an infinite supply of munitions, including for air defense, for their Arrow, David Sling, or Iron Dome. And they have needed in Gaza and for Lebanon, and to some degree for the West Bank, they have needed help from the United States in weapon systems, small diameter bombs, large diameter bombs, which the U.S. has been willing to export. And so the more that the U.S. provides assistance to the Israeli industrial base, does that sort of bring them de facto into the conflict and have other countries, particularly Iran, view them as a participant if they are providing the weapons used to strike targets? That's an interesting question. I mean, that is at least, I would say, likely with a protracted conflict. I mean, it's a problem the U.S. would have in a protracted conflict, not having enough weapon systems. So, I mean, I think that is a vulnerability. The longer this goes, is the Israelis are going to need help in restocking their weapon systems.
Emily, I want to close with you. You both were recently in Israel, talked to a lot of people there all the time. What are you hearing now? You mentioned you talked to one of your friends who is a former IDF general. Are the people in Israel optimistic that they can, really degrade Iran here and buy that time that you talked about at the top?
This is one of the striking things about sitting down and having really honest conversations with Israeli friends. As Americans, we come in full of optimism and let's fix things and let's have a permanent solution to this thing that's ongoing. You talk to the Israelis, and this is not, that they're not a monolith. There's a joke that you sit down with 3 Israelis and you'll get 4 opinions. They see this as just another skirmish in a 100-year war. And they really do see Iran as an existential threat. So from their perspective, they are looking down the barrel of Iran potentially having the ability to wipe out the entire state of Israel within 30 minutes. And that could happen in 6 months. Now is the time in their mind to try to preempt that and at least push it out further into the future. I think they are confident, not even hopeful, I think they are confident that they can push Iran's timeline out a few years. I don't think that they are confident or even hopeful that they can completely end Iran's nuclear program, but they see that as a trade-off they're completely willing to take. So, an ideal situation for Israel would be that President Trump and this administration get so caught up in the success of this particular mission that they're like, you know what, we're in. We're going to help you completely destroy Iran's nuclear program. Short of that, they will accept a 2-year or a 5-year break from this kind of worry, where they can hopefully continue to reshape the region in a way that's safer for Israel.
Andrew, if I could just add one interesting difference from previous Israeli attacks. So Operation Opera or Operation Babylon was the Israeli surprise attack conducted by the Israeli Air Force in June 1981 in Iraq against its nuclear program. There, the focus was on the nuclear program. And what the Israelis have done, much like, as Emily mentioned, their operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah, is expand this to go after the leadership structure. This is not just about the nuclear program. This is about the leadership structure. And we'll have to see what the implication is of expanding this from purely a military operation against a nuclear program to the leadership structure of the country, and whether that will push us in directions we don't fully understand.
I want to thank all 3 of you today for these incredible insights and for jumping on this podcast on short notice. So I really, really appreciate it, guys.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.